The Living World, Evolution of Biodiversity. This unit describes biodiversity of Earth and how it came to be and how environmental factors can cause and influence its decline. So biodiversity can be described as at a genetic level, at a species level, and then at an ecosystem level. The Living World, Biodiversity, the biodiversity of Earth. Before we bring in evolution, let's just talk about biodiversity in general. At the end of this section, you should be able to understand how we estimate the number of species on Earth, how we quantify biodiversity, and how we describe patterns of relatedness among species using phylogeny. It is difficult to estimate the number of species that are on Earth. I mean, a short walk through the woods or a corner lot or a city park, makes one thing very clear. Life comes in many forms. A small plot of unattended land or a tiny pool contains dozens, perhaps hundreds, thousands of different kinds of plants and animals visible to the naked eye, as well as thousands of different kinds of microscopic organisms. In contrast, a carefully tended lawn or a commercial timber plantation supports only just a few species of usually grass or trees. Remember that a species is defined as a group of organisms that is distinct from others in terms of perhaps size, shape, behavior, perhaps there's biochemical properties, and that it can only interbreed with individuals of that same group, and once it breeds with them, it produces viable offspring. So that last requirement, viable offspring, is important because sometimes individuals from different species, they can mate and they can produce offspring, but oftentimes those offspring do not survive to reproduce more fertile offspring. So the number of species in any given place is the total number of species on Earth and is a challenge to determine. Many species can be easy to find, like birds or, small mammals, watching elephants. But others are not so easy. Like some species are only active at night. Life has really wonderful way of having creatures go into locations like the deep ocean, or even where we actually just cannot see them. And even microscopic organisms where we can't even see them without a microscope. To date, scientists have named about 2 million species, which means the total number that must be on the planet is larger. The insects actually represent the group that has the most species out of any other groups on Earth. So scientists, for that one reason, usually can kind of get a good estimate of the number of insects in the world. If we can do that, we can have a much better idea of the total number of species in general. I've read about a study where researchers fumigated canopies of a single tree in the tropical rainforest. They basically put a tarp over the tree, fumigated the tree, and all the insects fell from the treetops onto a tarp on the ground. They took this collection of all these dead insects and basically took them back to a lab where they categorized them. They took one group, they counted the number of beetle species that fed on only just that one tree that they had fumigated, and by multiplying this by the number of beetle species by the total number of tropical tree species, they basically estimated that there is a total of 8 million species of beetles that fed on that one single species of tree. And because beetles make up about 40% of all the insects, and because insect species of the forest canopy tend to be about twice as numerous as other insects on like the forest floor or in the bush, the researchers suggested that a reasonable estimate for the total number of tropical insect species might be like 30 million. And more recent work within the last 2 or 3 years here has indicated that this number is probably a little too high, but we're getting better. So current estimates, total number of species on Earth range currently around 5 million and 100 million. But more scientists estimate that there are about 10 million species on the planet. So essentially, it's very difficult to estimate the number of species on Earth. The number of species in any given place is a common measure of biodiversity. But estimating the total number of species on Earth is quite the challenge. And again, scientists have named approximately like 2 million species, so obviously we have far more. We can measure biodiversity in terms of species richness and evenness. The number of species in a given area, such as a pond or a tree canopy or a plot in a grassland, is known as species richness. And species richness is used to give approximate sense of the biodiversity of a particular place or spot. However, we may also want to know about species evenness, and that is the relative portion of individuals within a different species in one location. So species evenness tells us whether a particular ecosystem is numerically dominated by one species or whether if all of its species have a similar abundance. An ecosystem has a high species of evenness if its species are all represented by similar numbers of individuals. An ecosystem has a low species evenness if one species is represented by many individuals, where other species are represented by only a few individuals. And in that case, there is less diversity. So as we take a look at this drawing here, scientists evaluating the biodiversity of an area must look at both the species richness and evenness. Consider these two forest communities, Community 1 and Community 2, in this figure here. Both forests contain 20 trees. And they are all distributed amongst 4 species. In community number 1, each species is represented by 5 individuals. In community number 2, only one species is represented by 14 individuals, and each of the other 3 species are represented by 2 individuals. Although the species richness of the 2 forests is identical, the 4 species are more evenly represented in community 1. And so therefore we would say that that forest has a greater species evenness and it's considered more diverse. The evolutionary relationship among species can be illustrated using phylogeny. Phylogeny is the branching pattern of evolutionary relationships. Phylogenies can be described with a diagram like this one shown. We call this a phylogenetic tree. The relatedness of the species in a phylogeny is determined by similar traits. So the more similar the traits the 2 species have, the more closely related to the 2 rows the species are assumed to be. So historically, scientists use most like these morphological traits, including like the large bone measurements, things like that, to measure similarity. But today, scientists base their phylogenies on a variety of other characteristics. We still include the morphology, but we also include behavior and, of course, genetics.